you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the media, and welcome to this media briefing by the Auditor General of South Africa. And let me welcome all journalists that are listening through different devices, those that are based in Cape Town, and those that are here with us today. And let me also greet the viewers at home that might be watching through different broadcasters, SABC, ENCA, and Newsroom Africa. Today, the Auditor General, Mr. Gani Maluleke, will present her first a general report on the national and provincial audit outcomes for the 2019-2020 financial year, which are normally audited under the Public Finance Management Act. We are going to start with the Auditor General, who is also accompanied by Ms. Alice Miller, who is the acting national leader at the Auditor General of South Africa. She will do a PowerPoint presentation. The copies of the media statement, the journalists should already have. Those who don't have, please indicate, just send a WhatsApp. We'll make sure that you receive it, including the presentation. The copy of the report itself is already being uploaded on our website, so you can quickly interact with the details on that particular one. Without any further ado, also note that we will be taking the questions through the normal, usual electronic platforms. So I'll send your questions. We will be able to answer all your questions, hopefully, and provide you with the necessary details. Without any waste of time, allow me to invite the Auditor General, Mr. Gani Maluleke.
Thank you very much, Harold. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to the media, members of the media. We thank you for the opportunity for us to share with you the insights derived from the work that our auditors conducted on the PFMA cycle for the year ended March 2020. As you know, that the work of the Auditor General derives out of the provisions of the Public Audit Act, but as well as the Public Finance Management Act. In this cycle, we audited the provincial departments, the national departments, state-owned entities, TVET colleges, as well as the public entities in both spheres of government. The expenditure budget that was the subject of our audits amounted to a total of 1.7 trillion rand. Financial year 2020 was really completed under the most extraordinary circumstances. With the COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant lockdowns, we had the impact of it being the extension of the submission deadlines for the financials, which was moved from the 31st of May to the end of July. A consequence of that is that our audits were then conducted later than usual. In that time, we must recognize that the resilience, the adaptability, and the partnership between the teams at the auditees and the teams of the Auditor General of South Africa, that has stood us in good stead. And it is credit to them that we're able to report to you on the outcomes of these audits. The annual financial statements and performance reports, as I've said, were conducted under these extraordinary, difficult times. And so it is only on the 31st of March for the new year that we are still reporting on the 2020 financial year. But that's the nature of how things panned out in the context of the world we're living in now. In reflecting on 2020, it's helpful to go back to where we ended when we reported on the year ended March 2019. At that time, we issued a clarion call. We called on the political leadership, the administrative leadership across all of government to focus on acting now on accountability. And at that time, we spoke to the new administration and indicated the importance of implementing sustainable solutions to preventative controls, in implementing consequence management, effective consequence management where that was required. At that time, we also highlighted the importance of instilling good financial management practices. And when we spoke to the new administration then, we encouraged them to use every opportunity to drive progressive and sustainable changes. You recall that we repeated this call when we issued the Special Report Number 1 and Special Report Number 2 on the real-time audits that we conducted on the COVID-19 Relief Fund. You may recall that at that time we audited across the PFMA cycle a number of initiatives and a number of expenditures that were associated with different relief programs responding to the pandemic. And at that time, we highlighted the same message. As we reflect on 2020, we note that our messages from the previous year have not been heeded. Whilst we're seeing some signs of improvement in this year, we remain somewhat concerned that we're not seeing the progressive and sustainable improvements that are required. We're not seeing that there are improvements in addressing the widespread weaknesses in basic financial management controls. Things such as implementing the audit action plans that are designed at the end of the previous financial audit. Things such as making sure that our IT controls are dealt with, record keeping is addressed, in-year management reports on financial issues are prepared, and that decisions are made on credible financial and performance information. We're not seeing those critical disciplines that must become a feature if we are going to spend wisely and deliver effectively. In noting that the status of internal controls has not improved, we can only look to the role that must be played by senior managers across government, by accounting officers, supported effectively by their internal audit functions as well as their audit committees. We've noted some encouraging improvements in the assurance provided by the executive authorities, by the coordinating departments. Notably, we've seen greater support offered by the provincial treasuries and the offices of the premiers in different parts of the country. And we're also seeing that the role played by portfolio committees as well as by public accounts committees across the legislatures, that is improving. So the critical aspect that needs great attention is what happens at the administration level under the leadership of accounting officers and accounting authorities, acting in a manner consistent with their responsibilities as set out in Section 38 of the PFMA and Section 51 of the PFMA. The outcomes indicate that, yes, we've seen a slight increase in the number of clean audits. And just to remind you that the definition of a clean audit is that audit outcome where there has been evidence of credible financial information, of reliable and useful performance information, as well as having no significant findings on compliance matters relating to financial and performance management. And that's what we then call a clean audit, and we often denote it in the green. The next category is the yellow zone, which is really where an auditee has been able to deliver financial information which at the end of the process we can confirm is credible. However, they have some finding either on performance information which is not useful or reliable, or they have a prevalence of significant non-compliance in the area of financial and performance management. The next few categories would include qualified audit opinions, where the audit statements have some concern in terms of their credibility, and there's a finding on compliance and performance information. And then the next level would be the adverse and the disclaimer audit opinions, which are even less desirable than the ones I've spoken to now. So this year, we've seen an increase in the number of clean audits, a decrease in the number of disclaimer audit opinions, and we've seen a decrease in the number of qualified audit opinions. This year, we're seeing that the dominance of the yellow zone continues, where a number of auditees end up with unqualified with findings. And yes, it's important to celebrate when an auditee realizes that important milestone where they have credible financial information. Our concern is that often amongst these auditees, not only do they not have the disciplines that allow them to prepare credible financial information in year, they are also unable to give us quality financial statements at the beginning of the audit process. In fact, only 49% of auditees submitted quality financial information at the beginning of the audit process. Some of these auditees end up with a number of compliance findings, especially in the area of procurement, meaning that the manner in which they procure goods and services is not consistent with the principles set out in the Constitution, specifically Section 217, and it is not consistent with the prescripts set out by the National Treasury. The clean audits, when we look at them in relation to the expenditure budget, represent 17% of the expenditure budget. The unqualified audit opinions, 40% of the expenditure budget, which says to you that 57% of the expenditure budget is being spent by entities that are able to present credible financial information, and the balance simply aren't. There is, in this year, a prevalence of auditees that we were unable to complete the work on as at the cutoff date for our analysis. So as at the end of November, there were a number of audits, 44 in particular, that we had not yet completed. We've subsequently completed those audits, and in our general report, we set out the outcomes of those audits. And many of them have a similar profile in terms of audit outcomes, so it doesn't change the picture in terms of the message that we're sharing with you today, where there are far too few clean audits, a dominance of unqualified, which have major concerns around disciplines, internal controls, stability of how they are being run, and compliance, as well as the qualified, adverse, and disclaimer opinions. In this year, we've seen 66 auditees improve their audit outcome category. Either they moved from unqualified to clean, or qualified to clean, or qualified to unqualified. However, that's set back by the regression. 35 of them went backwards into a less desirable audit outcome. And we keep grappling with why that would be. What is it that makes an auditee improve vis-a-vis one that regresses? And the one aspect that remains quite compelling as a key contributor to improvement in outcome is the stability and the filling of vacancies at key roles, specifically accounting officer and CFO. Over the years, our analysis has demonstrated a very high correlation between the tenure of an accounting officer and CFO and the audit outcomes. Many of the disclaimers are those where you don't have a CFO that stays more than 22 months on average, 5 years. So when we talk about the importance of filling these key vacancies and the importance of dealing with whatever risks there are towards the longer tenure of the appointed people, those principles, those concerns remain top of mind as we analyze these audit outcomes. One of the areas that we are flagging in this report is one that we flagged before around the financial health risks that present themselves as we interrogate the financial statements of different auditees across government. Specifically amongst departments, we found that 2/3 of them had some or other indication of financial strain. We found that 12% of them reported themselves in their financial statements that they were concerned about their ability to continue to operate. We found that there were 2% of them with financial statements where we could not even conduct that level of assessment. And if we go back and understand what are these indicators that the AG looks at when we consider the risks to financial health, it is the inability to pay creditors on time. It is the inability to collect debtors in the way that one should on time. It is operating on a net deficit for the year where the revenue is exceeded by expenditure for the year. It's about auditees where you find at the end of the year they've got a budget that they've overspent on their budget such that they have unauthorized expenditure, but they actually have spent next year's budget in this year. They've already spent a significant component of the forthcoming year's budget to fund operating expenses for this year, which then eats away at the ability to deliver services in the forthcoming year. Of particular concern in terms of the departments that have these high level of financial health indicators would be the provincial departments of education in many parts of the country, as well as the provincial departments of health in many parts of the country. On the departments of health, one of the major concerns is the dominance of these litigation claims. medical negligence claims, which have the impact of eating away at the ability of a provincial department to deliver services in the forthcoming year. Because they do not budget for these medical negligence claims, whatever they end up paying in this year is going to take away the ability to fill vacancies, to deliver services, to pay suppliers the following year, to buy or maintain the equipment that they require to deliver services at the level that is desired. We've also looked at the state-owned entities, and the stories around the number of state-owned entities that have financial health pressures, those are well documented in the public. We audit the majority of state-owned entities. Of the Schedule 2 entities, there are probably two of the biggest ones that we do not yet audit, being Transnet and Eskom. However, the large number of auditees, the Office of the Auditor General has been taking on those audits over a number of years now. So our report covers a large component of the state-owned entities. Financial health pressures are dominant in many of these. And without going into too much detail, I will highlight that as at the end of the financial year, there were a number of state-owned entities already at the end of March whose situation would have probably deteriorated as we look into the end of March 2021. A number of those had operated with a deficit for the year, had creditors being left unpaid for extended periods. A number of them even had adverse or disclaimer audit opinions, mainly because of not being able to apply the going concern assumption. Put simply, it's saying that as auditors, we were uncomfortable that those entities, without a guaranteed capital injection or a major shift in how they are operating, that they would be able to continue to operate into the foreseeable future. Often we talk about state-owned entities, the big ones. What often gets lost in the conversation are the smaller public entities. Over a number of years now, we've highlighted financial health risks at a number of smaller public entities for whom, if this continues, they will end up requiring capital injection either from their provincial government or from national government. So these risks at these smaller public entities equally have to be attended to. For 6 years now, we've reported on financial health risks at Sunral, at Road Accident Fund, as well as at Golden Leopards, which is one of the entities in the Northwest Province. And the list goes on in terms of how over many years we've highlighted financial health risks at some of these smaller entities, whom, as I say, if we do not attend to, will end up placing a greater burden on the fiscus. One of the areas that forms part of our compliance audit every single year is that on supply chain management. And we focus on this because we know that whilst there are a number of auditees that end up with compliance findings, whenever we drill deeper, we find that it is in the procurement area where they have challenges. And the areas where we find problems are around not having the discipline to ensure that there are competitive bids. Even matters such as making sure that there are enough quotes that are sourced before a decision is made to procure goods and services. We're seeing still a prevalence of extensions and amendments to contracts that are existing, instead of going out to the market to confirm that that which we are paying for on this particular contract remains fair and reasonable. We simply extend the contract. That compromises the confidence that citizens must have about fair and equitable access to business opportunities within government. It tarnishes the ability of government to demonstrate that its systems of procurement are transparent and that they're competitive, and that whatever they procure is done in a cost-efficient manner. An area of weakness continues to be where the regulations around local content are flouted. At the point of procurement, decisions are being made in a way that is not in compliance with the stipulated bid specifications around local content. When this continues, we then make it difficult for government to meet its stated policy objective of using its significant procurement spend to drive local economic activity, to drive the preservation of jobs, the creation of new jobs, and to ensure that local operators in the economy benefit from government spend. Another area that we believe is an issue for the policymakers is where the preferential procurement system is not being applied properly. So when government then sets out the requirements for how the procurement system ought to run in a way that finds a balance between empowerment on the one hand, which is imperative, and cost effectiveness on the other hand, which is also an imperative. So then there's this procurement system that's set out with those regulations to support those dual objectives, and those get flouted. Then unfortunately we spend a great deal of time figuring out if there's something wrong with the policy. Meanwhile, one of the key levers for us to achieve what we've all stated is important is happening in the context of where procurement actually is being decided upon, where those rules are simply not being applied. Another area that we flag in this audit is that we are still seeing a number of public officials, political office bearers, and public servants doing business with the state. And that is not in accordance with the public service regulations as recently amended. As of April 2016, that's been outlawed. And in fact, public servants were given up until the end of February 2017 to either stop doing business with the state or resign from their role as public officials. What we're seeing is that there are still some contracts continuing to be entered into and paid for where public servants are the counterparties or the business people. And yes, there's the role for the employee, but also there's a role for the entity that is procuring, for them to set up rules and systems and processes that will detect these non-compliances and act on them. We're also still seeing instances of false declarations made by suppliers, such that it is difficult for those that procure goods and services to demonstrate that they have avoided instances of conflicts of interest and the impact thereof. And the last feature I want to talk to around supply chain management is in the area where, in some instances, we cannot find the documentation that supports transactions that have gone through the books. So we find a transaction, we then ask for documentation to support that transaction so that we can confirm whether or not compliance has been a feature in the course of entering into that transaction. And in contracts to the level of 2 billion rand, we were unable to find the documentation which placed a limitation on our ability to complete our interrogation. Supply chain management non-compliances end up in many instances as irregular expenditure. And this year's irregular expenditure number that we're reporting on is 54.3 billion rand. It is less than last year's 66.9 billion rand. However, this is no reason to celebrate. We must highlight that the 54 billion rand that we're reporting on must be understood in a context where 31% of auditees, 118 auditees, were not disclosing their irregular expenditure accurately. There was some doubt about the completeness of the irregular expenditure disclosed. This number must also be understood in the context where it doesn't include Transnet and it doesn't include Eskom, who respectively reported figures of 56 billion rand and 11 billion rand for the year ended March 2020. So whilst we may see a reduction from 66 billion to 54 billion, there is absolutely no reason to celebrate. It's one thing to have a non-compliance that results in irregular expenditure. A different matter when there is a failure to follow up on that identified irregular expenditure. The PFMA, Section 38, as well as the irregular expenditure framework set out by the National Treasury, read together, those determine how an accounting officer or an accounting authority ought to act on irregular expenditure. Once it's been identified, the accounting officer is required to investigate what happened, to stem any losses, to recover any losses, to report any relevant matters to the law enforcement agencies, and to discipline the officials that may have done wrong. And they are also required to consider what internal control measures had failed and to fix those. When we see irregular expenditure accumulating year on year, it is a demonstration that which we expect is not happening. The pace and diligence around investigations is not evident. The discipline that should be enforced is not happening, so there are no consequences. The recovery of funds is not happening. The condonation of things that can only happen once we are clear on what gave rise to that irregular expenditure, that's not happening. And the write-offs are not happening. And all of that indicates that we are continuing to have a culture where there is tolerance for lack of compliance, where there is tolerance for people transgressing from that which has been set out. And indeed, when we flash this number of an accumulated closing balance of irregular expenditure of 262 billion rand, our main message is this. The system has much work to do before we can push back on the culture of tolerance for transgressions. So our message around acting now on accountability failures finds resonance on this slide, probably more than the others. The matter around a lack of consequences is what informed the amendment to the Public Audit Act. As you well know, from the 1st of April 2019, the Public Audit Act amendments became effective. And that instrument was designed to ensure that the Office of the Auditor General could follow up on the implementations of their recommendations so that we could influence and support the journey towards greater and more effective levels of consequence management. It's designed as a complementary tool, one that can strengthen accountability systems across the public sector. And put simply, the law now says, Auditor General, once you have audited and you have found a non-compliance, look deeper if it is a fraud or theft or a breach of fiduciary duty or even simply a non-compliance with legislation. We want you to look deeper. Don't just stop at flagging the non-compliance and reporting the irregular expenditure. Consider what the impact of that non-compliance is. Has it resulted in financial loss? Has it resulted in substantial harm to the public or to a public sector institution? Or has it resulted in the loss of a material public resource? And if it has, you will call that a material irregularity and you will treat it in the following ways. You will notify the accounting officer that there is this material irregularity, and you will highlight the action that's required by the accounting officer. If the accounting officer acts as required, as set out in the PFMA already, then you don't have to go any further. You can only follow up on whether they've done the necessary. However, if they do not act, Auditor General, we want you to go and refer the matter for further investigation so that you can be clear about what went wrong and who did wrong. When that investigation comes back, we want you to refer the matter back to the accounting officer and give a recommendation on the action that they must take. And you put that into your audit report, which becomes public information. And if they act on that, yours is simply to follow up and report. If they do not act in a way that's adequate, that's appropriate, or effective, we then want you to take the next step. This is now escalating the process towards issuing binding remedial action. And that binding remedial action will set out what needs to be done by the accounting officer with specific dates and timeframes set out. If they act on that, then yours is simply to follow up and to report. If they still don't act on that, then you would issue a certificate of debt. And that certificate of debt is issued in the name of the accounting officer who has failed on multiple occasions to do that which is actually their responsibility as given in law. So this is complementary to what others in the system should be doing. If an accounting officer takes our material irregularity and accepts the urgency with which they've got to deal with the matter and takes the appropriate action, then we don't have to do anything further. It is only if they don't, then we act. If an executive authority who's supposed to supervise and support that accounting officer, if they do what's necessary to support and supervise, then we don't have to take over their responsibilities. You only act as the Auditor General if there is inadequate, ineffective, or inappropriate action by the role players. If the oversight mechanism holds the accounting officer accountable in the way that they should as given in law, then the role of the accounting officer, of the Auditor General, is simply to use our reports to enhance the work of oversight by highlighting the urgent matters that need attention. So I stay with the slide to highlight that this instrument, which is an incredibly powerful tool to drive improved consequence management, will work when we keep giving the accounting officer every opportunity to act. Because by the time you issue a certificate of debt, you have to demonstrate as Auditor General that you have been fair, that you have given the accounting officer every opportunity to act, such that by the time that certificate of debt hits their pocket, it is fair and justifiable administrative action. If I just go back to the slide around how we empower different role players, and I'll just highlight again, when we issue an MI, we highlight to the accounting officer that of the 54 billion rand of irregular expenditure, these are the few transactions that need your urgent attention. And if you act on them, you'll be able to recover funds quickly, and you'll be able to deal with the internal controls issues that led to this problem, and follow up with the accounting officer. So ours is ready to act when there is continued failure in the context of the accounting officer and accounting authority, in the context of the executive authority, and even where the legislature has not been able to hold the accounting officer accountable. If we think about the context within which we are operating now, where resources are scarce and have to be stretched to meet the complex and competing needs of citizens, the urgency of us dealing with these transgressions, these accountability failures, the urgency of us avoiding leakage and stemming any potential further loss, that urgency cannot be overstated. I'll give you a feel for what we've done with this instrument over the last 2 years since it's been effective. You may recall that the first phase of our implementation in the year ended March 2019, we subjected 16 audits to the MI process. And at that time, we reported that we had found 39 material irregularities that had been notified to the accounting officer. 2 years in, we increased the pool of auditees that were subjected to this additional mandate. And a combination of the 2 years of effort, we have found a total of 75 material irregularities. And we've estimated the loss associated with these material irregularities to 6.9 billion rand. Yes, there's a difference between 6.9 billion rand and 54 billion rand. Much of it is because not every single irregular expenditure transaction results in financial loss. Some of it relates to matters such as tax certificates that are not there, local procurement provisions not being met, preferential procurement systems not being attended to appropriately, or contracts being extended without going back to market. And those things still need attention. However, that would account for the difference between irregular expenditure and material irregularity on the other hand. The areas where we found material irregularities, you would see, are really areas that are consistent with the weaknesses that we've pointed out over many years. It's areas around procurement, where bids are not being managed properly, where the fairness with which we are allocating contracts is not appropriate or is not demonstrated, where we even end up appointing suppliers that overcharge or even those that do not deliver. Some of the areas are about expenditure management, where we end up paying for goods and services that we've not received, or we pay for goods and services where quality is not demonstrated. Some of it is also about revenue management, where we don't charge customers what we should, and where we don't collect the revenue that's due to the fiscus. Others are about resource management, where we do not safeguard assets that are entrusted to us. To give you a good feel for the nature of these things, in procurement, we would find that, and I'll give you a live example, where the Northern Cape Department of Health issued a contract for medical waste management, and in the course of issuing this contract, our judgment, our analysis was that they had not issued it to the very best bidder in that instance. And we calculated the loss, having compared the two competing bids, and we were able to identify that had you procured from this individual or from this company, you would have done better by paying less. In that instance, the accounting officer disagreed with us, and so we've had to refer the matter to the National Treasury to help us figure out if our analysis is appropriate or if the accounting officer is correct. I tell you the story to demonstrate that the identification of these MI processes indicates that the discipline that must underpin how procurement processes run is not in place. It demonstrates that there is a potential for loss. It also demonstrates that as an audit office, we recognize that often you do need another party to act as arbitrator between ourselves and accounting officer, so that we are fair and reasonable in the conclusions we make, and that the action we then take as a consequence of these things is characterized by justice. An example of what happens around expenditure management, where we pay for goods and services, the Department of Health in Limpopo, we found an instance where they were paying for a contract to rent radiology equipment. And they paid in excess of 2.5 million rand for this equipment. And when we completed our audit, we had confirmed that this equipment was, yes, being paid for, but it was not in use. It was on the premises, but not had been properly installed, because the project of doing that maintenance work had not been managed well. So we raised this with the accounting officer, and they took action, which is what you want. They then negotiated with the supplier to ensure that they can extend the contract period and pay only for the period where they were using the equipment and not for the period where they were not using, so that they could avoid losing money unnecessarily. And that's one of the benefits of this MI process. We're able to flag to the accounting officer things that need their ongoing and urgent attention, and we're able to give them every opportunity to fix that which is going wrong. On revenue management, it may sound odd to say, why are we concerned about safeguarding of assets? So that 2.5 million rand that we report on as one of the MIs relating to safeguarding of assets was in relation to a grader which had been left overnight on the premises of one of the community members and not on the premises of government. And this grader was left with the keys inside. Now that's really about disciplines around, if you're going to keep a grader overnight, which is a key piece of equipment that's at the time it was picked up that this grader was missing, it had crossed the border, diminishing the prospects of ever getting it back. So when we talk about safeguarding of assets, developing and implementing controls that will prevent loss, controls which are not that complex to do. When we speak about that, it is these sorts of losses that we are hoping to avoid. It is our view that having raised many of these MIs over time, accounting officers are responding. I think in all of the examples I've given you, there's responsiveness in the system. Where we disagree, we continue to engage, and where we have agreed, accounting officers are taking the action that they should. So there's a bit of good news. In our report, we set out what's happened with the 39 material irregularities from last year, and as you can see, many of them were dealt with. At least 25 of them are still being processed. However, our conclusion is that the accounting officer, for the moment, is taking the action that's appropriate, that's adequate, and that will be effective. Some have been resolved, and there have been a number that have been escalated to recommendations in the audit report, which recommendations, if they are not implemented, then we will escalate the matter to remedial action. But that's in the minority. So the good news is that indeed the system is starting to respond. And I think that's one of the benefits of this instrument, that you are able to inspire an entire system to start acting not just on one material irregularity, but on fixing the controls that clearly are weak. We've identified an area that needs strengthening if we are to get even greater traction in driving improvements in the system. It is about greater collaboration between the accounting officers and the law enforcement agencies, as well as the public investigations bodies. There are a number of instances where accounting officers have responded to an MI by reporting a matter to the SIU, to the Hawks, to SAPS, and we are still awaiting the outcome of that. One of the areas also that we worry about in terms of the impact that will be limited for this instrument is the instability and vacancies at accounting officer and accounting authority level. Every time there's a change in accounting officer, we almost take a step back because we have to be fair to the new person, give them a clear sense of where things are, give them an opportunity to apply their minds and to shape the action that's appropriate. So that does set us back a few times. An example would be at PRASA, where there have been a number of changes in terms of the board, the administrator, another board, and in each instance, we've had to kind of take a step back to give the new incumbents an opportunity to engage with the matter at hand, which is really consistent with one of the first things we talked about when we dealt with the audit outcomes, that the thing that makes it difficult for the system of public finance management to really be improved on a wholesale level and to drive sustainable changes that are going to safeguard resources and drive greater effectiveness, that is in the area of vacancies and stability at key levels, and that needs attention. I'm now concluding. And having spoken about the audit outcomes, having started by reflecting on where we were at the end of 2018-19 and spoken about the MI process, I'll conclude by saying that all of us who have a different role to play in the system of public finance management have got to act now with the urgency that's required to prevent leakages, to recover that which is being lost, to instill good financial management practices, to deal with the financial health risks across a number of entities and departments. We spoke about the SOEs, we spoke about the public entities, and also the issues being raised at the provincial departments of health and of education, who are facing significant financial pressure, which will make it difficult for them to continue to deliver essential services to citizens. It is urgent that we all respond to the call of investing in strong, stable systems of preventative controls so that we can avoid losses, so that we can detect them, and so that we can apply consequences where they happen, so that over time, over a short time, we can ensure that the public finance management system is characterized by delivery, by cost effectiveness, by the protection of resources, and can win back the trust of citizens who must be able to have confidence that the institutions of government are there to serve them as designed. So I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, AG, for those insights. I saw the journalists that are here tweeting away quite a number of details. I've also been monitoring on Twitter to make sure that there's accuracy there. Thank you very much. Colleagues, we are now ready to take questions. We'll start with the questions that are here in Pretoria. We'll take them in a set of 4, and then we'll go to Cape Town, and then we'll go to the platform. Please introduce yourself. I hope I had introduced myself, and my name is Harold Maloka, so you can just refer to me as Harold. And then can we also make sure that those that are searching on our website that are said to be having difficulties in downloading the report, we're attending to it. We'll make sure that you get it. It looks like this for those that have not been able to find it. And it's a written consolidated general report for the PFMA for the National, Provincial, and audit outcomes for the 2019-2020 financial year. So without any waste of time, please, ma'am, be the first one.
Good morning, I'm Antoinette Slavat from our Portland newspaper, and thank you for such a beautiful delivery. I just want to check with regards to the medical negligence claims. You say the departments don't budget for it. Are they not required to make a provision? Because surely the claims are quantified at a certain stage, or are they required to do so but they fail to do it?
Thank you. Second question? There is none on the floor. Okay, there's one there at the back.
Thank you. My name is Mawande from the Sunday Times, and AG, thank you very much for your detailed presentation. I've got 2 questions. One is on the positive of the improvement on clean audits, as well as the overall 57% of auditees that presented credible financial statements, you said. What could we attribute this to? Some would say maybe it's the anti-corruption stance by the current administration of President Cyril Ramaphosa. Would there be any other factors that contributed to this improvement, and is it anything to celebrate? Could it have been more? Could it have been worse? Secondly, on the issue of the material irregularities and our whole system of certificates of debt, I heard what you said, H, but is there something tangible yet that we can celebrate, especially when it comes to the certificate of debts? Has there been money quantified that we can quantify that has been recovered through the system since it came into effect? And among those, if any money was recovered, was there a hand of politicians that was identified in some of these material irregularities? Thank you very much. I hope I make sense.
Thank you. Even myself, who's not an auditor, I can tell you that it makes sense, but we'll answer you. Thank you. Can we take the other questions from the platforms? Are there any other questions before I go to Cape Town?
Thank you. There are no questions this side.
Thank you very much. Cape Town?
Good morning. There are no questions yet.
There are no questions?
No questions this side.
Okay. AG, shall we start with those?
Okay. Thank you, Antoinette, for your comments and for your question. The medical negligence claims, often departments under budget for them. And our analysis is that they simply don't know what's out there, number one. And number two, their budgets are unable to cover them. I'll give you an example. The Gauteng Department of Health, in the year that we audited, had budgeted 2.6 million rand for medical negligence claims. They ended up paying 501 million rand in the year, which then takes away from other aspects of the budget for that year and for the forthcoming year. And that's what we're seeing across the country. Even when they do budget, it ends up being much less than what the costs are. They don't know what's out there in far too many instances, because records management is a problem, because these fraud claims, some of them are fraudulent claims as well, which hit them, and that, that creates additional pressure on the system. Mawande, the clean audits, yes, I believe there could have been more. One of the issues that we are flagging is that, first of all, we know that it's harder to keep a clean audit than to get it. And to keep a clean audit, one of the key pillars is about stable management who drive decisive internal controls measures and monitor them and apply consequences where things go wrong and fix on an ongoing basis. And that's what strengthens our resolve, that you've got to drive stability at those key levels, because without it, you're just not going to be able to improve controls in a way that can earn a clean audit, let alone keep it. So many clean audits are attained and many more are lost in a number of years, or over a number of years, because the system is not yet stable. And hence, when we say, let's recognize the new clean audits, it must be understood in a context where there are a number of regressions, and that's because systems are not stable. The one about what's the story about certificates of debt, I'll give you two answers. One is that the journey towards issuing a certificate of debt is one that must honor the process as mapped out in the legislation and the regulations that support them. It's also a process that must be consistent with principles of fair administrative justice. And we've got to give the accounting officer every opportunity to act, so that by the time you issue a certificate of debt, not only is the risk of it being found to be invalid because you didn't follow due process, but also it's fair, because you have indeed given that accounting officer every opportunity to act. So the journey of it, by design, does take time. I will say the second thing. We will not hesitate to issue a certificate of debt when we need to. I think by now, you know our office well. We take on these challenges and we conduct our work without any fear, without any favor, without any prejudice, but we do so with rigor. And we're going to implement this instrument in the very same way that you've become accustomed to. Where there have been recoveries, I've spoken about the Department of Health in Limpopo, which is an example, and there are a few others where we've seen accounting officers acting to either stop contracts where things are not going well, but many of them have started from a point of investigating what is going on. We will continue to follow up. And if in our assessment, in our regular assessment, we get the sense that the action that's being taken by an accounting officer is not appropriate, adequate, or effective, then we will implement our new powers. So the journey does take time by design. However, we will continue to implement as it's been set out. Have we seen the hand of politicians? When an accounting officer acts to go and engage with a supplier that they may have been overpaying, I think that's administrative. So I don't know any other way to respond to you. Thank you.
Thank you, AG. Are there any further questions? Mawande want to persist on the certificate?
No, the new question.
Okay, Mawande, please go ahead.
The first time around.
Yes.
The part where AG was speaking about auditees, where it was around supply chain management, auditees where you couldn't find documents that support transactions. Can we get some detail there as to what exactly do you mean that you can't find documents support transactions is the documents that prove that payment was made, or payment was made, but they are not documents that prove what the payment was made for. And also, what is the recourse for the taxpayers in instances like this, and just how bad was it in this financial year, this particular problem? Once again, I will go back to politicians. The reason I was talking about that, sometimes officials, come out with an excuse that I was instructed by a politician. So is there recourse in the work of the AG against politicians in such instances where officials claim that the instruction was a political instruction? Thanks very much.
Okay. Antoinette?
Actually, I'm also engaged with this no documents issue. I cannot imagine that there cannot be documents. Does that indicate that a number of officials are working together to subvert the procurement process? And what happens to those officials who should have kept the documents? Are there immediate consequences for them? That's my one question. And then the other one is, in previous years we've heard that the staff of the AG have been intimidated and threatened to quite an extent. Is that still the case? Has it improved or has it deteriorated?
Heidi?
Heidi Jacobs from the NCA. AJ, if I could just ask you to just elaborate a little bit on the fact that, we all know SAA and SA Express are, one's under business rescue, the other one's under provisional liquidation, but is it not concerning for the AG that we have not received any financial statements from SA specifically for the past 3 years? And what happens in a situation like that? Do we just wait for them to give us the financial statements over the last 3 years? If you can just elaborate a little more on the circumstances around SAA and SA Express.
Thank you. Any further questions from the platform?
Not as yet, thank you.
Cape Town?
No questions, thank you.
Okay. Ishi?
Thank you very much for those questions. Let me start with the easy one, Antoinette. The threats and intimidation of our teams. Maybe it's easy, but it's also critical for us. Over this year, we found fewer instances of threats on our teams. It may have to do with the remote working arrangements that are in place. I'm hoping that it's more than that, and that trend will continue in this direction. Obviously, that's an area of major concern to us, because these men and women are professionals who could do anything else, anywhere else, not just in South Africa, many of them in the world. And they've chosen to serve South Africa in this way. And when we threaten them, when people threaten them in this way, it's going to become difficult for the office of the AG to remain attractive as a destination for capable professionals who want to serve, which will not only diminish the capacity of the office, but I think will serve to create greater distance between institutions of government and citizens. So I worry about that a great deal, and I would want to make sure we keep our eye on it. So thank you for asking the question. So yes, a reduction, but we're not yet complacent. The question, Mawande, about tender documentation, which I know Antoinette also raised. When we did the real-time audit last year, and we looked at transactions 3 months after the fact, so we would audit the first 3 months, we audited the next 3 months, even then, there were instances where transactions have gone through the books, have gone through a bank account, and that a payment has happened, but then you cannot find the documentation to confirm how the tender was run. So the tender documentation that confirms what basis the decision was made on isn't there. And that's a 3-month period, right? So that tells you that something's wrong, and it's a discipline about document management but it's also a discipline around doing that which you can account for. And that's one of the flags we raised when we delivered the real-time audit. This has been a feature across our audit over a number of years now, which is why we report on it. So one might ask, why do you report on this 2 billion rand of transactions that you could not audit? It's yet another indicator of weaknesses in accountability, which we must push back on. When you see our audit outcomes on disclaimer audit opinions, that's really where transactions have gone through the books, payments have been made, but there is inadequate documentation to indicate what these payments were for or to who. And now, if somebody is unable to do that basic thing, you've got to worry about their commitment to safeguarding of resources, to acting as stewards over the resources that have been allocated to them to look after, let alone account and report transparently. So I would encourage us to look at it in both those instances when we talk about limitations on our audits, but also the disclaimer audit opinions. That's what sits behind that. And whether it's a municipality or a public entity or a department, that should worry us significantly. The political pressure, one of the things that the Public Audit Act Amendment does is give greater assurance to the accounting officer about the need for them to operate in the role that has been designed for them. If an accounting officer is appointed in terms of what the Public Finance Management sets out, and when there's this instrument that could deliver personal sacrifices and hitting you in the pocket, I think it does sharpen the mind of any accounting officer on how they're going to withstand political pressure. So when I look at this Public Audit Act Amendment, I think one of the untold promises of it is to professionalize the leadership of administration and government, so that you start to attract people who have other options and know it and have that posture that I'm here to serve and I will do so in the best possible way, and I will not withstand pressure because the law sits on me. Section 38 talks about accounting officer, not about a politician. The Public Audit Act talks about an accounting officer, not about a politician. So it's that accounting officer that would have to account. So I'm hoping that these amendments will serve to inspire accounting officers to lean into the powers, authority, and responsibilities that they have by design, and not give in to inappropriate pressure. And I think it can start to clarify the lines between who does what in the system. Heidi, SAA. Yes, you're right. There is the business rescue process, and at SA Express, there's the provisional liquidation. Without financial statements, there's not much we can audit. And what we can do is escalate the matter to Parliament, as we've done, starting with the executive authority, which we've done, and to Parliament. And you would have seen that certainly SCOPA and the Portfolio Committee on Public Enterprises remain on the issue, which is where accountability will be managed. Yes, we're concerned about it, and that's why we report on it as transparently as what we do, and have done for many years, about the lack of submission of these financials. Thanks.
Thank you, AG. Are there any further questions? Should I start with Cape Town first? Go to the platform. It sounds like we'll be heading towards the last round if there are any questions. Cape Town?
Nothing yet, thank you.
Okay. The platform?
No questions, thank you.
Okay. Pretoria? Okay. If there are no any further questions, it looks like we have become quite clear and quite direct. Hopefully we won't be getting a million questions from the side when the AG is no longer available to assist. Heidi, I'm looking at you.
I'll try not to.
No, thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you for the opportunity. The report is already been, its technicality has been resolved. It's on our website. You can download it from there. Should you need to have any questions or anything that you would want to clear with us, you can give us a call. And you can also find us on Twitter, also on Facebook, where we have already uploaded also a video of the presentation that we've already made. And we look forward to your reporting and continued engagement. And with that, I would like to close the press conference, and thank you very much, AG. Thank you very much, National Leader. And thank you for colleagues both in Cape Town and Pretoria and those that are watching through the other channels. This brings us to a close, and thank you very much.